Hello, everyone. My name is Geir Sigurðsson, and I'm professor of Chinese Studies at the University of Iceland. And I will be talking to you in this session about the notion of tradition, which I will be approaching from classical Confucian philosophy. And what I will do here is to provide you with an overview of what I have to say about this topic. And it's my belief that we can learn from the Confucian philosophy about how best to deal with tradition and how to understand the role of tradition in our societies. Now, I should say perhaps in the beginning that I will go through quite a few topics in this lecture or issues that I feel that are interrelated, and so please bear with me if you think that I am digressing, because I think in the end it's all going to come together when I get to the summary in the end. So let me just start here. Perhaps, and it's always useful, I think, to look at the meaning of tradition and what we mean by tradition. And if we look at it etymologically, we see that tradition comes from the Latin tradere, to hand down and or to transmit, and it refers especially to the way we hand down to posterity what has been happening or has been existing before. And of course, usually we mean those things to be the intrinsic features of a particular culture, whereby that culture is maintained. So this is what we are trying to do. We are maintaining the culture by handing it down to the generations that come after us. Since we are now going to be dealing with the Chinese, or in particular the Confucian approach to tradition, I think it's useful just to have a look at the modern Chinese concept of tradition, which is 传统, and it's composed out of two characters, 传, which means very similar to tradere, to transmit or to deliver, to hand over, and tong maybe even is even stronger than the tradition in English implies that it really has to do with the essential elements of something. So originally, tong refers to the main threads of a silk weave, so it's really the core of the silk weave, and so it really means the essential. So 传统 could be understood as handing down the essentials of a culture in this case to posterity, to generations that are coming. Now, 传统 though is a relatively new term in Chinese, and although I cannot be entirely sure, I believe that it's a term that was probably it may have been invented, to reflect the Western notion of tradition, because I don't think a tradition in that particular sense existed in Chinese. So when we look at ancient China or the classical period in China, so before Western influences, so what would have been the term that the Chinese used that more or less would correspond with tradition? And I believe that that's the notion of Tao. And probably many of you know what Tao means, at least how it has been used. Tao is, of course, the Tao in Tao Te Ching, which denotes a path or a way. And in this particular sense, it refers to the way along which we arrived where we are, and the way which we are continuing to forge. So there is a sense of an ongoing path that is continuing. It came from somewhere and it leads to somewhere, but as I will argue later on, it doesn't just simply lead somewhere. It really has to do with where we want to take it. So it's really up to us, and hopefully this is going to be clearer as I continue. Now, let's just think about the status of tradition in late modernity, in especially maybe in the West, but not only the West, as I will show. And I will go through this very, very quickly. It's simply to, as I think that many of you also have a sense for, that tradition is generally viewed with suspicion. That we, in our modern societies, we think about tradition as something that can be contrasted with reason. This is, I think I could state it's actually a consequence of the Enlightenment mentality that glorified reason and individualism up against the traditions that were most probably had very heavy influences on many of the states in Europe. And in order to undermine these heavy traditions that seemed to prevent progress and maybe liberalization of the societies, reason was glorified, so that it would be possible to further progress in Europe. And this is quite understandable, especially in many of the states in Europe at the time, that political power was, of course, in many ways traditional. The aristocracy ruled on the basis of tradition and so on. But these sort of political systems were perhaps not the most reasonable ones or the sensible ones. So it's not strange that that tradition was vilified as holding back progress. And so we also associate tradition often with parochialism and obscurantism. Obscurantism basically implying that there are really no good reasons for it. It's just something that confuses people and does not help them to develop. And I just want to provide you here with a quote in Karl Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte from 1852, which I believe really sums up the sort of modern attitude to tradition, that the tradition of all that generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, Marx says. And it's precisely in periods of revolutionary crisis, when they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and their surroundings, with creating something unprecedented, something new, that they panically summon up the spirits of the past, borrowing the names, marching orders, outfits, in order to enact a new scene in world history, but with this time-honored guise and this borrowed language. So Marx is basically saying that that the tradition has such a hold on us, that even when we want to revolutionize things and make some changes, tradition somehow tends to come back and bring us back into the situation in which we were before we began with our efforts. So that's a problem. Tradition comes back all the time. And there was in this period and in Marxism in general, there has been a very strong endeavor to start anew and to get rid of all the old traditions that weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And we see this also in very much so in China. So here we have from the Cultural Revolution that began in China in 1966 and was arguably the most radical and extreme period in the history of Chinese communism in the 20th century. The slogan "Smash the four olds, construct the four new." So the idea was basically that we should make a completely new start, and we should get rid of tradition and everything that has to do with the past and the traditions on which Chinese culture is based. The four olds were specified as old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. And anyone, in fact, who could be accused of being attached to any of these four things was actually very much in danger of simply being executed. So it was a demand for a completely new start on ground zero, if you like. Now, of course, this sort of demand had much older precedents, and we could also see this in the May 4th revolution in 1919 in China, where actually many intellectuals demanded that China would take up Western culture entirely and leave the Chinese culture completely behind. Now, so that's obviously very extreme, but I, just to show you that the vilification of tradition is not limited to the Western part of the world. It's also very much an important part of recent Chinese history. But so I'm not going to talk about that very much here. I mean, this is not a class on history. I just want to point out that even though traditions can be obstinate and they can be problematic, of course, and we should not forget that. But we should also be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And perhaps traditions have something to teach us, and that's what I hope to show in this brief class. Okay, so now we're going to be dealing with Kongzi or Confucius, and maybe some of you don't know very much about him. I just want to go very briefly through what he represents. He is a scholar of Ru, which is the Chinese for Confucianism, and he was indeed trained in traditional rites and ceremonies, which are of course very much a component of tradition. Ru scholars were in fact specialists in these traditional rites and ceremonies, Li as it's called in Chinese. I will actually talk a little bit more about that later on, because Li turned out from the Confucian point of view to be somehow the key to tradition and how to both preserve and develop tradition, as I will point out later. What Confucius did was that he lived in a period where it was called the Zhou dynasty, the period he lived in, and it was a period in which the Zhou dynasty was gradually disintegrating. So there was increased problems in society, even some disagreements between regions, and even some conflict were beginning. But although it wasn't really until after Kongzi died so actually in the 5th century BCE, that major civil wars broke out in China between the former regions, if you like, of the Zhou dynasty that had taken up or aspired to be states, and they fought between each other for 2.5 centuries until China was then unified again in 221 BCE. But Confucius was already sensing that something serious was happening to the dynasty as such, and he aimed basically at reestablishing the Zhou dynasty with its customs and values, if you like. So he took office in his home province of Lu, which is on the coast of present China, actually Shandong in China today. But then he lost it because of because of conflicts and probably some corruption, and never held an important position again. He traveled because now there were dukes and lords who basically wanted to run the regions as states, and he traveled to try to convince them to take up his philosophy, his teachings, his way, his Tao, maybe his approach to tradition in some ways in order to preserve. But he eventually considered his mission failed and dedicated his later years to teaching. I sometimes say to my students facetiously, I mean, it doesn't mean that being a teacher means being a failure, but because it may actually sound like that. But of course, I mean, if you look at Kongzi as a holistically, you will see that Kongzi was actually very successful. I mean, more than 2,500 years later, China is actually still very, very much influenced by the Confucian philosophy. Anyway, so a few just fundamental facts that Confucianism or Ru actually existed before Confucius, but Confucius changes. He makes a lot of changes in the or the approaches change a lot with Confucius. And so in that sense, he is really a great innovator. But it was already a certain tradition, if you like, and then with Confucius, the Ru school or the Confucian school develops as a response to the circumstances that I just described, the conflicts, and it really continues after Confucius's death with many of his followers. So it Confucianism or the Ru school becomes one of the so-called 100 schools that were vying for the best way to proceed out of the situation of conflict that was intensifying in China. And so it competed with the other philosophical schools in China and had very strong competitors, including schools that have been called Moism, legalism. And I would say that Confucianism is certainly very, it really places a lot of value on tradition. So in that sense, you could say that it is traditional. Confucius is also very traditional in that sense, because he is really trying to strengthen a certain tradition and the way we deal with tradition. But I would not say that it's rigidly conservative. I think that's a mistaken interpretation of what Confucius stands for. And I will just refer to one of his sayings there. This is all these, the numbers that you find in brackets here in the session, most of them refer to the Analects, although there are maybe a couple that refer to other writings, but it will be specified if the writings are different. But here in book 18, verse 8, he is, and I really urge you to look up these sayings, the Analects. You can find a quite excellent translation of the Analects by Robert Eno on the web, free of charge. If you just type in Robert Eno, E-N-O, the Analects, you will get to his website where you can have a free copy of the Analects, and I really recommend this translation, which is I find to be actually really very, very good. So what he says here is that he is talking about some cultural heroes of the past, some very important people, but then he says in the end, but I differ from all of these because I have no must not or must, implying in fact that he doesn't have any kind of preconceived ideas how things are supposed to be. It has to be evaluated in each case. And I think this is very, it really says a lot about Confucius as a philosopher, that he always wants us to evaluate the present situation in which we are and make decisions on the basis of these circumstances. Now, here for some Confucian terms that are particularly relevant to this theme, and all these numbers, they refer to the analects where each of these three is discussed. Ren, I would just say something very briefly about this. Ren has been translated as humaneness or benevolence or goodness, and there are some other candidates for translation. Ren is something like the highest value of Confucianism. Being Ren is being somehow the superb Confucian, I think the best sort of indicator of what Ren means. Ren was actually a new term. It was something that Confucius coined, and his disciples are often asking him what it means, because they seem to be confused about it as well. But I think the best indicator to somehow grasp what it means is just look at maybe the character itself, which is composed of two elements. So the left hand element here is pronounced the same, Ren, but it means human being. And the right element means the numeral 2. And what it indicates is that there is really no human being unless there are at least two human beings. So it means that our humanity gets developed through association with other humans. So that's a kind of a fundamental way of thinking, that we can only grow and develop by associating with other people. So it's a claim about the sort of inborn social aspect of humanity. So Li, which we will talk about a little bit later, and I will give you a list of possible translations, actually in French, because I'm making use of a French missionary, but no worries, you will understand immediately. This is has a very wide range of meanings, but and it has been translated in many different ways. But the most common is ritual, or ritual propriety, or just propriety. But you can understand it maybe loosely as referring to customs, customs that are somehow informed by tradition, customs that have been developed within tradition and are meaningful both to the person who is performing and the person who is watching or being addressed through these customs. We could take an example of such customs from our own society. I mean, just simply shaking hands is something that we do very automatically when we meet people. Well, of course, now during the COVID period, this custom has been undermined somewhat, but I think you know what I mean. This is a way to show that you are friendly and you are treating the other person with respect. And generally speaking, Li is precisely that sort of a custom that in particular refers to interpersonal communication and aims to demonstrate to the other person that that person is being respected. And then we have Xiao, which has been in history translated as filial piety, more recently as family reverence, and even intergenerational respect. And this is a very important Confucian term that denotes a certain attitude that the Confucians recommend that especially young people try to develop within themselves in order to, well, to be able to develop the right sort of relationship with the older generation. But in more recent interpretation, Xiao, I think, is something that follows us throughout throughout our life, and really denotes a kind of intergenerational respect, so that when we get older, we also have a certain respect for the younger people, and it helps communicating and mediating the tradition that we have inherited to the younger generation, although we also accept that aspects of that tradition will also be changed in the course of time. Okay, this is it's a complex issue. These are all complex notions that have many dissertations have been written on them, and so I'm unfortunately not able to give you an exhaustive account of what they mean, but I hope at least this gives you sort of at least an inkling of what they may mean. Okay, so what's so special about Confucius? Well, just very briefly, he really reformulated and expanded the Ru teachings. That's quite clear. While the for instance, ritual in the Ru, among the Ru scholars at the time, ritual was most probably a pretty inflexible kind of notion that referred to certain rituals, certain ways of behavior that could not be changed, that was somehow fixed. Confucius really infuses ritual with philosophical content. He makes it much more flexible and much more dependent upon interpretation and I would say creativity, in fact. He also universalizes the notion of education. He makes a very strong demand that everyone in society ought to be a recipient of education, so that they may develop themselves in society, implying, of course, that society is nothing without the individuals that form society. And so all the individuals need to be educated and have access to education. So he also places responsibility on individuals to be independent and creative. So not only learn the tradition, as we will talk about, but also create tradition, be innovative. And maybe last but not least, he emphasizes the importance that learning or education and activity, taking active part in society should be a joyful activity. It's something that we should think about as a kind of existential condition of being human. This is how we really enjoy being human beings. That's through association, through learning, which implies always developing ourselves, becoming better versions of ourselves, to use a very sort of modern way of putting it. I mean, the joy is actually mentioned already in the very first analect. So if you read the very first analect, Confucius speaks about the joy, first of all, of learning and practice what you learn, and also the delight of receiving friends from afar. So it's really about learning and associating. This is somehow, in some ways, we could say that this is the meaning of life. So it's a kind of an existential statement, I would say. Confucius is very important, but it can also be misunderstood, and has been even in the Analects itself. There is a very strong argument that we should not copy Confucius. We should. Confucius is a very good role model that should be emulated. And there's a lot of discussions of Confucius in the Analects and how he behaves. I will get to this in a minute. But the importance is that we should not copy. We should not do exactly like Confucius. We should be our own persons. There is this this character that comes. We come across in the Analects in a couple of in a few places. Who was called in some translations the village worthy, or the Xiangyan, who is somebody who simply copies or imitates, the people who are considered to be superior. So he does exactly like them, but he doesn't really seem to have any creative element himself. And he is being criticized very, very harshly in the Analects for being a kind of a hypocrite. I'm not sure if it's really fair to criticize him as a hypocrite, but because, I mean, maybe not all of us are very creative, and the best we can do is to imitate people that we understand are quite superior. But this is certainly not what we should be aiming at. We should not be aiming at just copying. We should emulate, but emulating means taking somebody as an inspiration to do things our own way. If you look at Book 10 in the Analects, you have a lot of descriptions of how Confucius behaves in the various situations. And I think some people have perhaps understood Confucius to be a kind of a pedantic guy in there. But he's, for instance, when he is in solitude, he really follows his own customs, and he, the way he eats and simply behaves in solitude. It's actually kind of funny because it looks like the disciples who probably wrote this down in Book 10, they must have been peeking through his window or something to see how he behaves when he's alone. But of course, what it means is that Confucius, he never lets his guard down. So when he is practicing Li, which is of course a kind of a training to sophisticate yourself, you should also do this when you're alone, because when you're alone, there is always this temptation that you fall back into some kind of, very sloppy behavior. And that sloppy behavior could also, you might accidentally fall back into it also in other circumstances where it can have quite terrible consequences. So Confucius is particularly aware of, always following his own principles and practice what he preaches. So many think that he is quite obnoxious in that sense and kind of boring. But actually, if you read throughout the Analects, there are many passages that show that he's actually almost like mischievous sometimes. He can be quite funny at times, and I would in particular recommend a paper written by Christoph Harpsmeyer some years ago, which is called Humor in the Analects, that really sheds a light on how funny he can be. And there are so many parts of the Analects where Confucius is shown to really enjoy good company, good food. He's like a gourmand, who really likes good food, good wine, and music, and so on, and enjoying. I would say that, in fact, if I were to sum up, what is it about? What is it that Confucius is preaching? I mean, he's preaching, okay, you have this one good life, one life, make the most of it, make it really good, enjoy it, But enjoying, of course, means develop yourself into the most sophisticated person that you can become, because that's the way to really enjoy being a human being. So, okay. So one very important aspect of Confucius's teachings is that, and in fact, maybe Chinese teachings in general, is the notion of time. That time is always taken into account, and things are always changing. This is something that you can get from other ancient Chinese writings, in particular the I Ching, which is usually translated as the Book of Changes or the Classic of Changes. That is constructed upon the theory or the fundamental idea that things are always changing. Now, Confucius as such may not refer so much to metaphysical or cosmological issues, but here is, for instance, one reference to him where he stands on the banks of a river, watching the river flow by, how it flows on, never ceasing night and day, and this has usually been taken as a reference to time, how things always change. So when you are very clear, or it's unambiguous that things are always changing and becoming very different, then you will also make draw different conclusions about things. And here is one other interesting reference to the Analects, where one of his disciples asks, is it possible to foretell 10 generations from now? I mean, how things will develop from now? And so the master Confucius says, the Yin, I mean, this is a past dynasty, the Yin dynasty adhered to the Li, so he's talking about the customs again, to the Li of the Xia dynasty. What they added and discarded can be known. This has been written down. It's been you can find records, of these differences. The Zhou dynasty adhered to the Li of the Yin dynasty. What they added and discarded can be known. As for those who may follow after the Zhou, though 100 generations we can foretell. Okay, I don't know about the foretelling, if that's really true, but what Confucius says here is basically that it's perfectly normal that the customs will change from one dynasty to another, or through time in general. So that's completely acceptable and normal, simply because all the circumstances in our surroundings will also be different. So Li, if we think about Li as kind of our social responses to situations, it's perfectly understandable that they will change. And in fact, I want to refer here to the Li Ji, which is a compilation of different short writings that came out in the Han Dynasty, but in Han Dynasty was from 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century AD, but I think Li Ji was compiled probably in the 1st century AD, maybe 2nd. I can't remember right now. But many of the writings that make up the Li Ji are much older, and in one of these chapters now called the Li Qi, or the tools of Li, or something like this, it says, for Li, time is of greatest importance. So there is an emphasis that you have to take time into consideration when both practicing Li and trying to evaluate Li. And the late Chinese scholar Jin Jingfang comments on this short sentence, saying, that is to say, Li follows the times and changes along with them, but is not invariable. So the ancient period had its ancient Li, and the modern period has its modern Li. To assume that the Li of Confucius is such that funeral practices must have certain foodstuffs served in certain sacrificial vessels, so that nothing has changed since ancient times, is to have not really grasped the Li of Confucius. So Jin is arguing here that, you know, it's not about preserving everything as it used to be. I mean, that's not the spirit of what Confucius is teaching. He's actually saying, yeah, we would like to try to preserve the spirit, perhaps, of what we have been doing, because then we are preserving the tradition in some ways. But that may mean that we have to change the practices as such. You know, that's quite necessary in order to preserve the spirit. Okay. Now, learning is very important in this regard. I mean, learning is kind of a fundamental Confucian demand, and like I told you already, it occurs in the very first analect, which is not insignificant. It actually really sort of perhaps gives the tone, you know, for what is to follow. So learning is really a dual key to both a flourishing, sophisticated individual and society, and it should also be an enjoyable activity, not something that people are forced to do. They should be. We have to develop ways to enable people to really enjoy learning. So this is the first analect. Sun Tzu, one of Confucius's followers who lived in the 3rd century BCE, he starts his own very big work, in fact, with the sentence that process of learning never ends. You know, so really emphasizing learning is something that you're doing all your life. It's not something you're just doing when you're a kid or you're going to school and so on. It's something that's happening all your life. And that's a very important statement there. You know, so, you know, it's supposed to instill a certain attitude that we are always learning. You know, it doesn't just stop at some point. It doesn't matter how old we are. It's something that is happening as long as we are alive. And what learning means, it's a continuous improvement of one's humanity, of becoming more human. I mean, I like to identify it with humanization in a way. So it's really about developing refined sensibility for one's surroundings. Again, here I'm also referring to sections in the analects that you can look up and compare. At the time, Confucius would emphasize the 6 arts as a kind of a curriculum of learning. So it would be Li, the rites or the customs. It would be music. It would be charioteering. Maybe we could say driving a car today. Archery, history, mathematics. So these would be the sort of the fundamental subjects that we should be focusing on. Now, we would probably not necessarily recommend charioteering or archery today, but why were they taught? Well, I mean, of course, they were both practical topics, practical skills to learn, but Confucius also believed that they were important for the formation of character. But we would not necessarily need those today. But music, for instance, was for Confucius extremely important as something that would help to make us more sophisticated and maybe more discerning about our reality, and to develop a kind of a rhythm for things, because rhythm is something that we need to refine our sensibility for certain social situations, which is also what the Li is about. Now, also what's important about education is that it's not something that we just do in the classroom. You know, it just happens here and now, in every moment of our lives. So Jongyong, which is a very important chapter in the Li Ji that I just mentioned before, has been translated, for instance, focusing the familiar, the title, that is to say, or centrality and commonality. And it really emphasizes precisely that the source of learning, the source of developing, is simply the everyday life. We don't have to seek far and wide, to learn. We can learn from where we are simply by being, simply by associating with others. And this is what Confucius says in the Analects. When in the company of only two others, I am certain to find a teacher. Realizing where they excel, I follow them. Realizing where they do not excel, I amend my own way. So we can always learn from each other. And this is, of course, very much a sort of a relational aspect of human life. Here another one is Ren. Remember, Ren is this highest, perhaps, value of Confucianism. And here he is maybe trying to respond to some of his disciples that asking what Ren is about. And then he says, is Ren really remote? He's trying to make them understand. It's not something that you have to, seek in some distance. It's really just here. As soon as I want it, it is there, he says. So, focus on what you are doing here and now and try to learn from that. That's your source of improvement and learning. And Mengzi, or Mencius, who is also one of his disciples, so followers, not disciples, sorry, follower who lived in the 4th century BC. He says, the Tao is near at hand, yet people seek it afar. The task is easy, yet people seek it in difficulty. Let all people treat the parents as parents and elders as elders, and the world will be at peace. So he's basically saying the key to becoming a loving, caring individual who takes care of his or her society is really in one's own environment. Okay. And the family is very important here. It's, I would say there are mainly two reasons for that. It's a pillar of social stability, something like the glue holding society together. And it goes so far as to, Confucius claims that this is xiao, duty towards parents. In this particular analysis, the story is that someone comes to Confucius and says that in my village, people are so honest or just that when a son discovered that his father had stolen a sheep, the son actually reported him to the authorities, and Confucius basically shakes his head. You can almost see him shake his head, and he says, "Wow, where I come from, being just or being correct is not like this." And then he says these famous words: "Father covers for son, and son covers for father. This is being upright. This is being just." And of course, Confucius has been criticized a lot for this. That he seems to be recommending some kind of mafia-like behavior. That you should always cover for your next of kin, even though they are they are not honest or they could even be criminal. But this is not exactly what he means there. He's basically saying that we should not let the authorities deal with this. The authorities are a very impersonal kind of institution. That we should not appeal to in these cases, unless there is nothing else to do. What we should do first is trying to resolve this situation within the family, convince the father that this is wrong, and then have the father return the sheep and maybe pay some damages or something like that, so that he can actually mend his ways. But if you just report them to the authorities, you have already alienated son and father, and that's really a very serious issue that may not be mendable in the future. the idea is basically that in a dissolving family, all we have, I mean, the glue that really holds things together is the family. So when the family breaks down, everything is basically lost. And it's kind of interesting in my own society. We also have fairly old writings that are still extant, and we can even read it in Old Icelandic. And there is this one very famous chapter on Ragnarök, as it's called, which basically means Armageddon, or the end of the world. And one of the descriptions of the end of the world of Ragnarök is when bræður munu berjast, or brothers are going to fight between themselves. I mean, that's when everything is really lost. You know, when you have lost the mutual care and affection of the family, then there is no way to save the community. So this is one thing. The other thing is that family is also the locus of one's first steps towards humanity. So it has to do with learning, you know. So we start within the family, and affection and care and love basically are things that we are supposed to learn, and we have to learn them. We learn them with the people that take care of us in the beginning, who are usually our family. So that's why it's very important to look after the family, because the family is, at least in most cases, the group of people who are going to be able to put us onto the right track in life. And it says so in for instance, in the second analect, you know, also very important, is that the root of Ren, the root of becoming this person who can associate with others, is Xiao. Xiao is this filiality or you know, family reverence. You know, this is he's basically saying that this is how we learn how to become Ren, or we take the first steps towards Ren. And of course, it has to also has to do with the sort of general recommendation that we are correlating our conduct with those who are near at hand. We learn from each other. We have no means to learn without how to become a human without having other human beings. So again, this idea of Ren, the human being, and the numeral 2, which is, you know, indicative of what it means to become a human being. So here we get to tradition, maybe in a more concrete way, has to do with learning, has to do with our upbringing, and so on. And so let me just read out this this quote here: "Learning without reflection results in confusion. Reflection without learning results in peril." So what does this mean? Well, okay, so learning without reflection. Learning without reflection means something that we just take the tradition without really reflecting upon it. And that's going to result in confusion. Why? Well, because things are always changing. If we let tradition simply dictate what we are going to do, or what our values should be like, or, you know, how we should respond to things, we are going to be confused about how to really behave. We have to adapt tradition to the circumstances. So that's the critical engagement, you know, that we need to know what the tradition is like, but we also need to be ready to change it if we need to. On the other hand, reflection without learning results in peril. So basically, if we don't build upon it, then we really lack a base, and we have really no way of knowing what to do at all. In another, actually, is the last book of the Analect, book 20. It is said, those who don't understand ritual propriety, as a kind of I would say representative of tradition, are unable to take a proper stance, which is also Li. So, if you really have no idea what your tradition is about, then you don't know how to behave at all. So you need both. You need to learn it, but you also need to reflect on it. Or as I would interpret this sentence we just looked at, if we don't do it critically and creatively, then we are just going to stagnate. And tradition should not just be followed blindly, as it says in the Analyst. Human beings are able to broaden the tradition. It's up to us to broaden the tradition, but the tradition does not broaden human beings. So if we only follow tradition, we are going to be stuck. And there is another beautiful passage in the Jongyong that I have also already referred to, where it says, Confucius says, those born into the present age and yet return to the ways, the Tao of the past, will cause themselves misfortunes. So we cannot afford simply to cling to the past tradition and expect that it will not change. We ourselves have to be creative and innovative in trying to adapt it continuously with the present circumstances. Okay, this is actually taking longer than I thought, but actually I think I'm just going to continue, even though it's going to be probably longer than an hour here. And then when we meet, I will just sort of summarize things. Okay, but I will still go fairly quickly through the rest. So self-cultivation, xiushan, or keji, you can also call it haoxue, or the love of learning, is really closely related to this. So you could say that you are learning formally when you are a child, and when you grow up, you start sort of being more responsible for your own learning, which is of course supposed to take entire life. So you could call that self-cultivation, and it really has to do with finding your own voice or your own maybe identity within the tradition. And so what's going on there is that there is an adaptation of tradition, which is also a kind of a self-expression. It's an appropriation of tradition. It's making the tradition your own. And Confucius is very demanding of his disciples. So he says once, if I show the students one corner and they do not return with the other three, I do not repeat myself. So he really wants creativity here. He wants some kind of development coming from the disciples. Now, if it had been different, it had been the other way around. If when showing the students three corners and they do not return with the last one, now that would be a very different thing. Then he would be saying, okay, I mean, if they cannot infer what is supposed to come from my teaching, like this one single answer, then he would be a kind of a dogmatic thinker, or at least he would come across as a dogmatic thinker. But he's exactly doing the opposite. He's saying, no, you have to create it for yourselves, because I mean, you will always be find yourselves in circumstances that are very particular, very peculiar to you. And so it's really up to you to come up with these three corners, if you like, So self-cultivation is really this critical, creative engagement with tradition. And it's also necessarily a relational practice, because we are, like I've been pointing out, we develop ourselves through association with others. As it says in one very well-known passage, humane persons, that is to say, persons who are ren, establish themselves by establishing others. This is how we work. We develop others we develop ourselves by developing other people. So we could say that self-cultivation can also be a misleading designation. And when we think about it, when we are cultivating ourselves in the Confucian tradition, what is the real object of cultivation, especially when we consider that developing ourselves means that we are actually developing others at the same time. So it's really a kind of a relational thing where the self is simply at the center. Self is really never isolated, it's always associated. So when we are cultivating ourselves, what we are actually cultivating is our relationships. So I'm cultivating my relationship, for instance, with my wife or with my children or with my friends or with my students or with my colleagues or friends. Did I say that already? Yeah, maybe. And so on and so on. You know, so I'm making my relationships better. That is exactly what self-cultivation is. And so it should lead to a profound sense of responsibility or empathy, because what you are is not simply yourself. And I want to just point out, I will not say so much about this. This is also a very important chapter from the Liqi, the Daxue, is called The Great Learning. And it's kind of like the program of Confucianism, if you like, you know, in a very condensed form, where self-cultivation is somehow it's explained as kind of self-extension. I mean, when you're cultivating yourself, you're extending yourself. Your self is becoming bigger. You know, as you can see here on these concentric circles of identification, as I call it. You are cultivating yourself. I mean, through ritual propriety and humaneness, which is Ren, is expanding you all the time. So you start with your family and you move to the community, the country, and the world. You know, so you base it on your natural affection for your closest one. So that's the family, and then you extend yourself to be concerned about always bigger, always a bigger sphere of people in which you with which you associate, and basically this is what constitutes the difference between the superior person, who is called the Junzi, and is a very common term in the classical Confucian literature, and we could call it superior person, and Xiaoren, which means something like the petty person. Petty person is always egotistic, always just thinking about him or herself. But the Junzi is somebody who is really thinking about the big picture. And the more sophisticated you are, the more you think about the big picture, the world as such. And this is from this is describing the chain of the development from the Daxue. So it says. The ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue throughout the kingdom first ordered well the states. Wishing to order well the states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. The extension of knowledge is by the investigation of things. So it's a kind of a chain of different practices where one leads to another, or one consists in another. But what is important here is that they're not saying that you have to finish, say, investigating the things before you can extend your knowledge, and you don't have to finish extending your knowledge in order to become sincere in your thoughts. You don't have to finish being sincere in your thought in order to rectify your heart. This is all happening at the same time, you know, so one consists in the other, and this is the way to do it. You just have to think maybe extensive enough, you know, or which is of course demanding, but is quite possible. And here is a reversed chain of development in the Great Learning. It's formulated a little bit differently. This is Robert Eno's version. So he's saying that what we do is we investigate things, or he calls it align affairs, will lead to the extension of understanding, which will lead to perfect genuineness of intention or being sincere in your heart, which will lead to balancing one's mind, which will lead to refining one's person, which will lead to aligning households, which will lead to ordering the state, which will lead to setting the world at peace. So this will happen through our self-cultivation. We just have to think about our self-cultivation as a much bigger associative process. So almost there. Now, just want to say something about Li, because the key to tradition is really Li, which we could also call intangible heritage, perhaps. So, I mean, it's the key to tradition in everyday action. And we can call it intangible heritage, but we can also call it a social grammar of sorts. It has been called, it's like the grammar we use to have meaningful interaction with other people. And it, of course, changes just like grammar does throughout time. And in many of these cases, maybe most of these cases, we as individuals have to induce these changes. So, I mean, Li is not carved in stone, not at all. And I just want to repeat now what I already referred to when Zhejiang asked about, you know, how Li, I mean, Confucius basically tells him how you can follow the changes of Li to get a sense of all the changes in history and in the process of civilization. Now, Li, like I said, has been translated in many, many different ways, and I just want to show you this here. I mean, this is from a French missionary from the 19th century, but I really find this passage to be so wonderful. He is trying to enlighten us about the meanings of the different meanings, or the scope of meaning of Li. And so what he says, he translated Li Ji. He says, as much as possible, I have translated Li with the word rite, ritual, of course, or rite, which has a very broad sense, like the word rite in French. But it has to be admitted that depending on the circumstances in which Li is used, it can mean, and then you have this long, long list of words in French that I think most of you are able to understand. So here you have, you know, a sense of how broad it can be. And what Li does, I would argue, is that it forms habits, it disciplines, it provides attunement to body. We get a sense of our body and how we should move in certain circumstances, how we can respond to things. It has to do with attention to detail in our environment, sensitivity to our surroundings, which is important. It's very similar to forms and movements in martial arts, which are kind of, you know, when you're training the forms in martial arts, you are actually gradually getting a better sense of what's going on around you. And Li works in a very similar way, but it's a kind of a social grammar, yeah, again, you know, that enables you to somehow respond appropriately to the situation in which you find yourself. And first, of course, you have to learn the forms, like you have to learn it, you know, you kind of, you know, dogmatically, like you make some part of kind of movements, you know, just like the forms in martial arts. But gradually it becomes very fluent, you know, and you will find a way also to reinvent, and make maybe new responses to new circumstances. And that's exactly what you are supposed to do. That's exactly what we are all supposed to do, according to Confucius. I just want to point out that habit has been discussed in Western philosophy as well, as there has been some attempts to rehabilitate, you know, if you like, the notion of habit. And maybe John Dewey is one of the better known philosophers who have written extensively on the positive aspects of habit. He says habits prevent thought from straying away from its immanent occupation to a landscape more varied and picturesque, but irrelevant to practice. Outside the scope of habits, thought works gropingly, fumbling in confused uncertainty. Habits actually enable us very much to function in our environment without having to think about things too much, and so we can save a lot of energy through our habits. I mean, just imagine if we didn't have any habits, and you would wake up in the morning and then suddenly think, oh, "What am I supposed to do now?" You know, instead of what we usually do, we get up and we brush our teeth and have our breakfast, and we think about the day that is ahead, and we can plan things without having to reinvent the wheel every day. So in many ways, habits can be very, very good. And like Dewey, of course, didn't tire of pointing out, we can also form very positive habits. Like we can form the habit of being critical of things, you know, of thinking about things in a critical manner. Okay, so and here from a couple of people who have been focusing on ritual and how ritual helps us to get a better sense of where we stand and how the effects on the body, how a kind of a body sense is being formed when we practice ritual. Now, I mean, I could actually take many more examples, say from Pierre Bourdieu, from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and others who have also talked about this. It's just to give you maybe a couple of examples of people who have written on these sort of things. So sorry, this has been longer than I expected, and now I just want to summarize the main points that I think we can take from the Confucian interpretation of tradition. You know, just to be very sort of brief and simple, that we are simply thrown, to use a Heideggerian notion, we are thrown into an environment that already possesses a culture, that possesses traditions. Now, of course, today we have several traditions. Now, Confucius was in particular fond of the Zhou tradition, so he wanted to rehabilitate or try to re-establish that tradition. I mean, this is not something we should be doing. We are not trying to re-establish the Zhou tradition, but we do have traditions that have been formed throughout a long period of time, and when we are thrown into these environments, it would seem that it would be immensely useful for us to get a grasp and understand, you know, what this tradition is all about, and the more profound understanding we can have of it, the better we can perhaps understand what can be changed, or what should be changed, you know, and what should be perhaps retained in some ways. We have to figure out the modes, the rules, the structure of this environment that we are born into. Otherwise, we are not going to function. And then we come to understand what works, what does less so. Of course, if we don't understand it very much, then we are not really able to. We're not in a position to critique it, you know, really. So, I mean, we really have to gain as good understanding, insight into it as we can. And then we modify, I mean, through our own comportment. I mean, we are all representatives of the tradition. And throughout, with our customs, with our interactions, with our ways of associating with others, we are modifying, hopefully, the customs or the values of our tradition simply by acting, you know, And the more conscious it can be, probably the better. And in this way, we are actually participating in developing the tradition. We are doing precisely what I talked about in the beginning, that we are forging the way. We are moving the tradition along the way. And I just want to finish with the words of Alistair MacIntyre, that how we understand and how we approach traditions. I think it's very important, and we should not understand traditions as relics. We should understand them as really living phenomena, living aspects of our environments. And if they are supposed to be active, if they are supposed to be living, then they have to embody both continuities and conflict. I mean, there has to be a kind of an ongoing dialogue about what constitutes tradition. And I think we can actually learn a lot from the Confucian philosophy about how to deal with tradition. And okay, I apologize that this was a little bit too long, but it's also a big topic. And when we meet in class, I will just touch upon a few issues for to sort of review what we have been going through here. Thank you.